Hi, I'm Hanspetermeyer, and I'm talking to Mark Holland. This is the third of our conversations about the Comox Valley Sustainability Strategy. Right now we're a particularly rich place in the Comox Valley because we actually have the 4 local governments and a whole raft of community organizations engaged in the strategy that HBLanarc, the firm that Mark is a principal with, is leading. So Mark, you guys have been, you said earlier, you did your first part of the your part of the conversation in 2007, and now we're coming to the end of 2009. I'm wondering what kind of insights you have, not just about the Comox Valley and how we're responding to the need to actually talk about sustainability, but what it means for you as a sustainability practitioner and working with communities.
It's a really good question, Hans. Probably, there's a lot of insights that one gains at different times from doing this work. I think one of the first that is interesting is how rarely we actually stop as a community to have a conversation about where we're going. Mm-hmm. We do plans and we do planning work, but even strategic plans and our whole official community plans don't typically look forward more than 10 years at a time, and many of them are less than that. So the trend lines of where we're going or what we're working toward always remain fairly short term, and that usually means that we choose pretty pragmatic, what we're pretty sure we can do today kind of solutions and discussions, and that's fine for that. What's interesting though is that the assumptions around what's common sense, what we can do, what's common sense, what's available to us, is really based on the last 10 years of our memory. Right. Which is already out of date. We know that that's always out of date by now. In this market, in this industry, in our society, things change so fast.
Well, I'm just wondering how you even talk about that. I mean, we don't really have I think pretty much everybody understands that we're dealing with climate change in some way. Whatever drives it, things are changing.
Sure.
But we don't really have a clear sense of what that means. I mean, some people think their waterfront homes are going to be underwater. You know, we don't know how much rain is going to fall. I mean, how do we even think about sustainability then?
Well, and I think that's a great point, because the essence of actually looking ahead into the 21st century is to ask ourselves, or what are some of these big things that might be different? And so climate change is very definitely one of them. That's to whatever extent all the different forces are impacting it. There's no debate anymore about whether it's changing, and what the implications are pretty serious from everything that the world science community and economic community is telling us is pretty big. The big shift in oil and the supply of energy is going to radically change our transportation systems, our food systems, the technology that we all consider as normal for moving around, a whole host of assumptions. It's not the end of the world as we know it, if you will, but it is the start of a whole lot of very interesting changes and opportunities. There's a whole long host of things that come into play when we start looking further down the head, and I think that that's probably one of the intriguing insights that I've discovered, is that it's ironic that even though this is all of our collective future together, we don't very often ever stop to ask that question. And in fact, almost no communities have ever stopped to ask that question until sustainability showed up. There were, bright minds in design who might sit down and be hired to do a 100-year plan for a city, but it was all based on the assumptions of what we all knew was normal. Right. So they would take those and they would plan where roads go and lay out 100 years of development, and that's fine. But it was really done in the complete absence of thinking about how are the forces that shape our cities and our lives going to be potentially quite different, and what does that mean for an area. So that's been one of the first interesting insights, I think, is actually how ironically new it is to look ahead. The interesting thing around sustainability is that it was not an ideology that anyone set out to create. It just evolved by asking that question. So if we keep doing what we're doing for another 50 to 100 years, what happens? And the conclusion was, well, we can't keep doing what we've been doing. And it wasn't that it was wrong, it's that we didn't know what we know now. And now that we know what we know now, we're going to need to make some changes. How do we make the changes? Oh, well, now that's the big challenge, is how do we make them? Even what changes do we need to make? Like where do we need to change to? Lots of debate around that. But what's exciting about a sustainability planning process is you actually get to have that conversation together. Right. And even though people disagree about a lot of different things, they often find a lot of common ground around what we're all trying to create. Right. People want a great place to live. They want a strong, robust economy. They want community facilities and services that provide them with what they need for a great quality of life. We want to be able to go for a walk with our family and the kids and the dog.
Right. These are all kind of motherhood kind of things, right?
Yes.
I mean, those are easy to agree on. So, but actually working in a real community that's got some history of,
yeah,
not working together on what seem to be motherhood kinds of things. What kind of insights do you have for us? Practical kind of things that, somebody watching this might go, oh yeah, this is something we can do, or if they're another community that's facing some of the same kind of challenges, this is something that we can do.
I think particularly in a small community, a small and rural community, or in the case of the Comox Valley with four of them, four different kind of communities or identities and realities involved, the discussion has to be very respectful. And I think if any process, including ours, has struggled, it's by not paying enough attention to the subtle specifics of what people have said about what they personally really want.
Mm-hmm.
When you participate in a process in a larger, more anonymous city, having been a city planner in Vancouver and worked in a lot of large cities on projects, everyone comes, attached to what they believe. But it's all essentially sitting in an assumption of kind of anonymity in this
right.
larger collective. When you work in a small town or an environment of several small towns, as in the Comox Valley, the assumption of anonymity is not there, and therefore the need to respect the different opinions visibly, audibly, to show that you've heard them and responded to them is really critical. Because in the absence of that, I think people feel ignored, they feel insulted, because there's an expectation based on the strong sense of community and personal time you get in a small community that you really should be listened to. And the truth in every community is that city council are your neighbors. But if you live in the city of 500,000 people, they're your neighbors, but not really. You don't,
right.
Unless they happen to physically be your neighbor, then you don't really know them as your neighbor. When you live in a small town, they literally are your neighbor, and you do know them, and you may work with them, or for them, or they for you, or you're all around each other. And as such, the nature of the dynamic takes on more of a family dynamic, I think, and that's a different way of approaching things. It means that there's going to be more debate. Mm-hmm. It means that you're not going to get along as often. It means also that you're more passionately engaged in a future that you both feel is going to affect you directly. It's not kind of a generic future, it's very much yours.
Right.
And so that changes the debate and the discussion. And I think any process, ours or any others, that has had to engage so many different topics that people both agree and disagree on from so many different points of view, it's an exciting process. I think it's an emotionally challenging process to kind of have that discussion. What's important in Comox is that we're having that discussion,
yeah.
Because if there is something, the point is not to make everyone agree. The point is not to have everyone have the same sense of identity, because that richness and the diversity is critical. What we are trying to achieve is enough agreement on how we can work together to achieve the things that we all know we all need to achieve. So they can sound a bit motherhood, but when you start working through who needs to do what to achieve that, it gets very gritty and very real very quickly. And I think that's been a key insight around this, is that the nature of the discussion is quite different in a place like the Comox Valley than it might be in a large city. And a lot of the big sustainability plans that have been done, the big ones at the same depth as the Comox Valley one, most of them come from large cities. So Calgary, Edmonton, other big cities, Vancouver and others. There's not too many regions like this that have done this kind of in-depth discussion. So in some ways I think Comox Valley is really blazing a way, not just in their core sustainability strategy, but in actually how they're having conversations with each other. And it's an unknown world. We don't quite know where all that's going to go. And creating the strategy isn't the end, it's just the beginning. Right. So what we get to see is how this sense of building enough collective agreement on where we need to go and who might need to do what to get us started. It's going to be fascinating to watch over the next few years and decades as everyone starts to work together. And we'll all be smarter tomorrow than we were today. So this is a plan, and it gets us part of the way there, but it's going to need to be constantly revised and updated and rewritten as that collective document of where we're trying to go together.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mark.